Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name's Brendan Cole. The dramatic television images resonated around the world when three women, Amanda Berry, Georgina De Jesus and Michelle Knight, returned home after being held in captivity. They'd been kept in a house in Cleveland, Ohio, after being abducted up to 11 years ago. The suspect, Ariel Castro, is a former bus driver. He's been charged with kidnapping and rape. Even after a decade, the families of those abducted women never gave up hope. The parents of Madeleine McCann, the most high-profile missing persons case in recent British history, have said that the discovery of the three women in Ohio gave them fresh hope that their daughter will be found. There are other high-profile cases, such as April Jones, whose disappearance in Powys, Wales last year sparked the largest search in British police history. But there are disappearances that do not make as many headlines. In the UK, some 250,000 people go missing every year. They are people of all ages. Some are abducted, some drop off the radar, others are taken by people that are known to them. But how do families cope with that? How do they go about searching for them? What's the psychological impact of a loved one going missing? And what's the role of the police and the law? To discuss this and the issues surrounding it, I'm joined in the studio by Catherine Meyer. She's the chief executive of Parents and Abducted Children Together. It's an organisation she founded in 1999 after her sons, who were then aged 9 and 7, were abducted by their father. Also here in the studio is Dr. Raj Persaud. He is a consultant psychiatrist and best-selling author. And in the studio here is Martin Dales. He's a friend and spokesman for Peter Lawrence, who was the father of Claudia Lawrence, who went missing in 2009 in the city of York. And on the line, we have Leah Steele, who's a solicitor at Lyons Davidsons Solicitors, and she deals with estates of missing persons, among other things. Thank you very much for joining me here. Martin, I'd just like to get your view, first of all. The images of three women missing for almost a decade, does that give fresh hope to Peter Lawrence, your friend, whose daughter has been missing for nearly 4 years?
I think it's always very encouraging when something like this happens. The battle and the emotions and the mixed emotion and the whole psychology of the whole thing, when somebody you love has been away for so long and you don't know any answers, there is no crime scene, apparently. It's got to be good for hope. And in fact, he's always been very positive about this in public. Obviously, in private, I think we would understand if people collapse in a heap quite frequently. But in public, he's always tried to keep that line of hope, which has been undergirded, really, by his Christian faith. And that's been a great thing to him and support from his church.
There's a book that's out about her disappearance. Can you just briefly explain the circumstances of what happened?
Yes, it was a most bizarre occurrence. Claudia was meant to be meeting up with her father, and there seemed to be a gap between when anybody last saw her and when Peter actually went into her house. She lived on her own in York, to actually find that she wasn't there. And it only sort of came really courtesy of a friend's phone call who was expected to meet her on the Thursday night. So this 36-hour period, she hadn't even been at work. So there was a call to the police, and that's where this journey, sad journey, has started and carries on, because we still don't know the answers. There's no evidence of anything. Nobody's been charged. And the police, it's a nightmare for them.
What about the immediate aftermath as the months passed? I mean, how did the family cope with that?
I think everybody coped in slightly different ways. And Peter was determined from the outset to actually keep her name in lights in the public arena. And that's when he asked me to help him. We've been friends for 30 years. Claudia was our babysitter. So we all go back a long way as families. So I thought, well, perhaps she'd just gone off on holiday or something without telling anybody. But she was pretty family related and didn't really operate in that sort of way. So it seemed totally uncharacteristic. We spun into action, really, and ever since then it has been very high profile. And obviously, like a lot of these things, the profile of the thing dies down after a period. But as you just rightly said, we've just been helping write a book about the first 3.5 years, which has been a lot of work, but we hope it actually brings everything together in one place, and hopefully also be of help to people who find themselves in what is a ghastly and grim situation for anybody. I mean, Claudia was 35, by the way. She wasn't the sort of the Maddie McCann age. So it's a different sort of thing, really, but not a word has been heard since.
Catherine, you had a very different story. You knew who had taken your children. Can you tell me a bit about that?
Well, it's, as I say, a very different story. I mean, my children went on holiday to see their father. I had custody of them. And then a few days before they were due back to come to London, I received a letter saying I'm not sending them back. And for the next 10 years, I saw them only for 24 hours. And so it's a different type. I mean, but pain can never be compared. But the not knowing where your children are, and in the cases of missing and the cases we hear, is probably the worst thing in the scale of horribleness. But also, for instance, in cases of parental abductions, when your children are away and they're small and you don't know what is happening to them, you're not putting them to bed. But then separately, you also have the fact that a parent who abducts a child doesn't say to the child, I'm doing it because I'm wonderful, and your mother or your other parent is wonderful. They're usually taking the child, saying to the child that the other parent is a monster, sometimes that the other parent is dead. So you go into the Stockholm syndrome, the parental alienation. And of course, as a parent, you worry a lot about what's happening to your children. And then the third element in all this is you have to also deal with the legal side. And so, although you are the left-behind parent, you don't see your children, you don't know what's happening to them. You also have to deal with court cases, with judges, people immediately. My case was a long time ago. People in the street, people who didn't know me. My case was very high profile. They thought, well, what's wrong with this? And also, well, the children are fine there with one parent.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. We're discussing missing persons. With me in the studio is Catherine Meyer, Chief Executive of Parents and Abducted Children Together, Martin Dales, spokesman for Peter Lawrence, who's the father of Claudia Lawrence, who went missing in 2009, Raj Persaud, a consultant psychiatrist and best-selling author, and Leah Steele, a solicitor at Lyons Davidsons Solicitors. Your organisation deals with all parents of abducted children, whether they know them or not.
We are not a helpline. We work very closely with missing people. What we specialise obviously in parental child abduction, but we are really campaigners for policies to change. We work very closely with CEOP. We are now coming out with a big report on child abduction and number of children that are abducted in the United Kingdom. It's a big mystery, and we're talking about the whole spectrum of abduction, from parental abductions to strangers' abduction to abduction by gangs for rewards, for money. Yeah, we try to change the system, make new policies, and create awareness of a problem which is actually a really enormous problem, and it's not improving. More and more children go missing.
Raj Persaud, can I bring you in here? Is there psychologically any kind of difference between how, say, somebody who has had a child abducted, whether that the person who abducted the child is known to the child? Does that, in terms of coping mechanisms, is that done in a different way?
Yes, I think the variety of different circumstances in which these terrible tragedies occur make a big difference in terms of the coping approach. And again, although if you lose a child because they die in a car accident, or that you lose a child from death, is a pretty terrible experience, must be one of the most terrible experiences anyone could go through as a parent, psychologists would argue that a missing child is actually worse, because the not knowing, the uncertainty, leads to a lot more rumination, and the rumination and the fantasizing about what could have happened, it leads to a lot more strenuous efforts to problem solve, to try and find the child, and the more you try to find the child but it's fruitless, the more desperate and unpleasant it is. So the uncertainty means that a missing child where you don't know what's happened is a lot worse actually than a child where something terrible's happened but you know what's happened.
And what if the missing child has been abducted by a parent? You know that presumably the child is going to be safe, that their welfare is being taken care of. Does this make it more difficult?
It's difficult to compare stresses. Just because a child's been taken by a parent, particularly if the parents are alienated from each other, doesn't mean it's any less bad, in my opinion. I think it's pretty awful all round. I mean, after all, one of the things you're concerned about as a parent is the welfare of your children, and you strongly suspect your children are probably not being properly looked after, but also your own relationship with them has been poisoned or being destroyed by the fact the child's been removed from you.
Catherine, your response to that. So knowing that your children are with a parent who presumably has the welfare of the children at heart makes no difference in terms of how you cope with it.
You can never compare pains. But the point is that I always say a parent who loves his children will not separate his children from the other parent. So the first principle is a parent who abducts his or her children is not really doing it for the welfare of the child, except in some extraordinary circumstances when there was abuse or something. But in normal circumstances, it's usually revenge, it's usually possession, it's not actually. Children need both parents. And the point is that there are some cases that we hear in the press, and they always talk about tug of love, but then sometimes you see at the end, there was a custody dispute and you realize. But there were also several cases of ending up in murders. And I know of several cases in the UK. There was one, for instance, not very long ago when a father lost custody and he had the children just on an access visit, and he put them in his car and gassed his children and himself, and asked actually even the children say goodbye to mummy. So this is really, sometimes it is an act of revenge. I'm not saying all parental abductions are the same, but I'm saying that some of them are extreme and lead to death.
Raj, can you explain that absolute extreme behaviour, the killing of somebody's children simply out of spite? I mean, what kind of state of mind have they been driven to?
It's unfortunately something that is not vanishingly rare. It happens, and often it's a man, or it can be a woman, but it's more often the man who says, if I can't have the children, then no one can have them. The man might be going through a very disturbed mental state, might be very depressed. A lot of people regard this as, in the world of psychology and psychiatry, an extended suicide. They kill the children and then themselves. Sometimes in a disturbed mental state, they may feel that all the children have to look forward to is a life of suffering, so in some sense they're protecting the children from that. But you can see, given that this kind of thing can happen, why just because you know where your children are, if they've been abducted by another parent, because that's playing at the back of your mind, it's an extremely stressful situation.
Catherine referred to the expression Stockholm Syndrome, a kind of feeling of alliance with your captors. You've written about this Ohio case, and you've alluded to the possibility of Stockholm Syndrome.
Well, we don't know the full details of the Ohio case just yet, and a lot of people are arguing that Stockholm Syndrome doesn't apply to this particular case. Stockholm Syndrome is about the idea that if someone is abducted by a stranger, let's say, and the abduction goes on for an extended period, a decade, the question arises, as it does in the Ohio case, how is it that an escape never seems to occur, or escape attempts don't occur? And one of the theories to explain this is maybe some kind of warped attachment develops between the person who's abducted and the abductor. And this first arose as an idea back in the early 70s, and Stockholm Syndrome is named after a bank robbery that went wrong, where some hostages were taken. And when the police attempted to release the hostages seemed to bond with the people who had taken them hostage, which was a bit odd. And the next famous case that explains the syndrome is the famous case of Patty Hearst, who was an heiress who got abducted by a terrorist group called the Symbionese Liberation Army. Despite the fact she was held in a closet for up to 70 days, she seemed to join the terrorist organization and was even photographed and filmed holding up a bank on their behalf. So one of the theories about what's going on here and this warped bonding that can occur and may explain why escape attempts don't happen and why an extended abduction can occur is that, first of all, it may be a survival instinct. You bond with the person who's torturing you or being cruel to you in an attempt to stop the torture or the cruelty. And if you're a very young person, after a while, that bonding can mean that you actually think that to escape could endanger your own survival because you depend so much on the person who's...
It's a survival mechanism, but could you extrapolate that to include, say, a parent who abducts their children and turning the children against the other parent? Is that a kind of Stockholm Syndrome, or would that be too much of an extrapolation?
No, I think all the forces involved in Stockholm Syndrome, in terms of the various reasons why this kind of warped attachment can occur, could apply in a parental abduction. And remember, although Stockholm Syndrome is rare, there are at least about 7 documented cases of prolonged abductions, particularly where young people, it tends to be young people, not older people, have been abducted, and where escape attempts were possible. I'm not saying this applies in every case where someone is abducted for a long period of time, but perhaps it does explain why, for a very extended period of time, when escape is possible and it doesn't occur, some peculiar psychological things happened between the abductor and the abductee.
The law has changed in the United Kingdom with regard to missing persons. Leah Steele, can you explain the change in that law and what benefit it has? It's brought into line with Scotland and Northern Ireland, hasn't it?
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. The most recent act that's come in is this Presumption of Death Act, which was given assent at the end of March. Now, essentially, there has been legislation in both Scotland and Northern Ireland up to 35 years now, where if a person goes missing for more than 7 years, a presumption of death certificate could be given. Now, the new legislation essentially simplifies all of the processes. The law that we had in England and Wales previously was very piecemeal. You could require several different applications or different approaches in order to deal with one person, which obviously was incredibly stressful for everybody involved. It was just a very difficult process to deal with. Now, this new act means that one application can be made to the High Court to deal with one person. It simplifies the process. It gives the High Court further powers to deal with this. And hopefully it means that there will be less stress and less victimisation of the families when they do have to deal with this.
Martin Dales, this was something that Peter Lawrence and his family were lobbying for, wasn't it, this change?
Very much so. It is good news, and it's good to hear Leah agree, because it's one piece of paper to cover everything that could have anything to do with their affairs, rather than this constant, and let alone the cost of such complicated law which previously existed. Peter actually wants one other thing really brought in, and I know the government actually is encouraging the Law Commission to look at what he calls guardianship, which exists in Australia, and means that within a much shorter period of time of somebody going missing, that a guardianship of the person's affairs can come into being to stop all the chaos that goes on when somebody goes missing and they can't access their affairs. And, people have got very close to losing their homes and jobs and all sorts of ghastly stories which are entirely avoidable. That is the next pressure on government, is to get that work done and to get legislation either tacked on to presumption of death or in a separate sort of capacity.
Leah Steele, is that likely that legislation could go through? I mean, it seems that there is a kind of no man's land for missing persons, and that's very difficult for the families to operate and to deal with the trauma.
It's bound to be difficult. There's no way that you can say that these circumstances could be anything less than incredibly traumatic. As for whether that legislation is likely, I think that's far higher decision than I have power over. However, as Martin's already said, this is something that's in place in Australia, but there's nothing in place at the moment in either Scotland or Northern Ireland, which of course the bill in England and Wales was based on. I do know, however, that it's been referred to as a stepping stone when the bill was discussed before it became an act. So certainly it's possibly under review.
Catherine Meyer, I suppose the default position when a child goes missing or is abducted is for a parent to keep hope.
Absolutely. I mean, without hope you can't live. And I think hope is a very, very important thing to always keep.
It was a high-profile campaign. How important is the media in terms of these kinds of campaigns?
First of all, the media is a double-edged sword. And I think, for instance, in cases of parental abduction, my case was very high profile because it was unusual. It happened between two European countries. So it was good because then there was much more awareness about parental abductions. But on the other hand, the courts can use it against you. Say, look at this woman, she's terrible, she's in the newspaper, does she care about her children? So that is the negative. The positive is that your children, now my children, will be able to see whenever they want to look at it, that since they were taken, I have always tried to see them. So I think for them it was very important. On cases of missing, people again react very differently. I mean, the McCanns went very much to the press. It was also in the month of August. In the month of August, there are less news stories coming out. The child was very small. Some people say it's because she was pretty. Obviously, it makes better photographs. But I think the media in general is a good thing because it creates awareness, and then you still hope that maybe one person would have seen that child and called the police.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name's Brendan Cole. We're discussing missing persons with Catherine Meyer, Martin Dales, Raj Persaud and Leah Steele. Raj Persaud, do you think there's an even-handedness in the way the media deals with missing persons? And in terms of how I suppose people relate to the story, the appeal of the story is empathy, but also horror that it could happen to you.
Yes, no, I don't think there's even-handedness because, as you pointed out, there's just so many people that go missing and only a very small number of them get media attention. And the ones that get media attention, really it's about what fits with the needs of the media. In the McCann case, I think that one of the reasons why that got so much attention, but it was a kind of event that most people could identify with. Most people have had young children, they've taken them on holiday, they've had difficulty finding their children from time to time. No parent hasn't had that experience. So it was a nightmare situation that people could identify with, and that's one of the reasons the press astutely went with it. It had really nothing to do with looking after the interests of the McCanns or of that missing child, I'm afraid to say. So I don't think there's an even-handedness. Unfortunately, parents, on top of the stress they've got with a missing child or a person trying to find another missing person, have to become very media savvy very quickly, very media astute, if they're going to handle the publicity machine, which undoubtedly is helpful in terms of trying to gather information.
Martin Dales, you're a spokesman for Peter Lawrence. You had to handle that media machine.
Yes, it was quite strange, really. I mean, first of all, I think I want to say that the majority of the time the media have been first class with us, mainly because I think we were very open with them from the outset and set our stall out. Unwittingly, not thinking this thing would go on for months and months and then let alone years. But I think the other aspect of this is, as Catherine said, it is a two-edged sword. Because we had some difficulties with one particular newspaper who decided to take apart Claudia, and she wasn't there to defend herself. And her friends and family and everybody else, we had to do that for her in her absence. So it does have its moments and its problems, but I have to say, certainly in our case, we've managed to keep the media with us. We obviously, as time goes on, you can't carry on at the rate you were doing. The first 4 or 5 months was unbelievable amount of work, energy and effort to keep them on board and to keep them interested. But in fact, it seems to have carried on, and the book seems to be doing well, I gather. So there is a lot of interest in this sort of thing. But God forbid it happens to you.
Catherine Meyer, I mean, your organisation, Parents and Abducted Children Together, I mean, how important is the role of the media in terms of what your organisation is doing and what your organisation is trying to achieve?
Very much, because otherwise you would be doing something or some changes, you would be calling for some changes, and if it's not reported in the media, then who is going to know about it? So I think the media is important. It's important also for us very much on the parental child abduction, because I think people should be much more aware of the dangers. And sometimes, it happens, I don't know, a woman goes on holidays in Greece, falls in love with a Greek man, they get married, and then if a year or two later she decides, actually, I want to go back home, and she takes the child back home. She doesn't realize that she's actually doing something which is illegal. So I think media is important because it creates awareness, but it is important also mainly because you can push the government to make changes. So everybody knows that anybody in government reads the Mail, reads the Sun, and so if suddenly you have a newspaper who's backing a campaign that you're doing, it does help to push for change.
Raj Persaud, we've got 250,000 going missing each year. There's a lot that...
Yes, but I also think an important point to make, the relationship between people who are trying to find someone that's gone missing and the press and the police is a very complicated one. And there's more going on than meets the eye. One big advantage to getting the press involved is it some people would argue it keeps the police more interested in the case, because the police, frankly, are overwhelmed. And the statistical evidence is that the initial hours after a person goes missing are the absolutely crucial hours in terms of investing maximum resource. And as time goes by, particularly after the first 2 hours, your chances of finding a person begin to drop off dramatically.
But that's exactly when the police will not consider them necessarily missing, though.
Yes, so that's one of the problems. One other point I want to make, and this isn't widely known, is that the police also use the press. So, for example, very unfortunately and tragically, those televised pictures you sometimes see of weeping people making an appeal for someone who's gone missing, one of those weeping people has actually committed the murder of the missing person. And there is a lot of very interesting psychological research being done on the fact that sometimes if you look at genuine appeals as opposed to appeals from a person who's actually committed the homicide, there are body language and other things you can pick up that identify the person. So the police actually use that press conference as part of their strategy. If a child has gone missing and is killed under the age of 5, statistically speaking, the most likely person to have committed the murder is a family member. And so there are all sorts of reasons why often children, particularly the younger you are, the person who's committed the murder, if it is a murder in terms of a missing persons case, is likely to be known to the child. The point I'm trying to make is the relationship between the press and the police is quite a complicated one, and there's more going on than meets the eye.
I think Raj is absolutely right about the business of those first few hours, because we had a great problem that it was 36 hours until anybody had actually spotted as a 35-year-old adult. Why would you necessarily follow somebody around and phone them up every day to make sure they're where they are? And that 36 hours has actually proved the most difficult time lag.
For example, though this statistic doesn't apply in your case in terms of an adult, the statistics are that within 2 hours of a child going missing, if the child has been killed, 40% would have been killed within the first 2 hours, and 70% within 3 hours. So, that initial time lag is absolutely crucial.
Martin Dales has explained what he would like to see in the way of legislation. Catherine Meyer, on May the 25th is International Missing Children's Day. I mean, what would you like to see? Are missing persons enough of a priority for the police here in this country?
It's a complicated issue, but International Missing Children's Day is a very important day because it's a day that it started in the United States and it's now finally marked in the United Kingdom. And it's a day that we are trying to remember all the children that go missing. And it creates, again, awareness of the number of children. Last year, we did a big campaign, in fact, with missing people. And coming back to the question that you were talking about with the press. And, for instance, we were distributing posters of missing children, which Missing People does as well. We had a big campaign on International Missing Children's Day. And the point is that to have the press, to have poster campaigns, to have things like the Child Rescue Alert, which is something that we've been trying to introduce from the United States for many years. It was used for the very first time in the April Jones case, is also not only a way to galvanize the population to help the police find missing children, but it is also, I think, a very strong message to predators that we will all work together to try and find children. And this year on International Missing Children's Day, we are coming out with a big report that took us about a year and a half to work on, which we're publishing with CEOP, the Child Exploitation and Online Protection. And we've started to look at the number of children that are abducted in the United Kingdom. And believe it or not, we don't really know. And so we've looked at the information that is around, based on police reports, based on academia, to come out with a report coming out on the 23rd of May. And we're coming out with some statistics which you will find very, very interesting.
Raj Persaud, the final word to you.
Well, I think it's very interesting. We have two people here in the studio who have done the right thing in terms of the psychology of coping, because we need to talk a little bit about how parents cope with this terrible thing. And one of the later tasks in terms of coping is what we call reinvest the emotions or learn new skills. And what these two people have done is they've invested themselves in a worthwhile activity, which is how do I form an organisation or get active in terms of raising the profile of this issue. And that's absolutely the right thing to do. Parents who've lost a child or a person who's lost a best friend, who've got involved in activity, charities, raising awareness of the issue, it's the correct coping response to a very difficult situation.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. That's Raj Persaud, who's a consultant psychiatrist and best-selling author. Also in the studio, Catherine Meyer, Chief Executive of Parents and Abducted Children Together. Also here in the studio, Martin Dales, friend and spokesman for Peter Lawrence, the father of Claudia Lawrence, who went missing in 2009. And on the line was Leah Steele, a solicitor at Lyons Davidsons Solicitors. Thank you very much for joining me, Brendan Cole, on The Voice of Russia in London.